A warm welcome from here in Scotland to all my Liberty friends. I'm truly sorry not to be with you in person, but COVID-19 made it logistically impossible. But I'm grateful and honoured to be able to speak to you this way about the dreadful attack that happened on your ship. Sometimes I pinch myself that I, a British journalist living in Scotland, are speaking to you knowledgeably about this issue, because it should have been something that the American press and media has picked up on and dealt with long ago. I first got involved quite a long time ago, in fact in 1999. It was part of a TV project that culminated in us producing a BBC film called Dead in the Water, and indeed a book. And ever since, kept coming back to me that there is more to this story even than the book was able to explain. I feel now that I'm closer to the truth, and in fact it's even more extraordinary when you dig even deeper into what was going on. A new book is on the way. I've actually nearly finished it. It's going to be called Goliath's Guilty Secret. It's called Goliath's Guilty Secret because Goliath is America, not Israel. Of course, there's no doubt that Israel was responsible for the attack, but the role of America, your country, in the whole thing is really quite extraordinary, and it needs to be exposed. What happened to you guys on June the 8th, 1967 was actually a seminal moment in world history, and yet the true story has been buried by your government, and the reason is that what happened was so shaming, not just to Israel, but to America too. Only by a hair's breadth did the world avoid a nuclear exchange. The superpowers nearly led us into a Third World War. And of course, the story starts with the Liberty incident, the attempted obliteration of your state-of-the-art spy ship for reasons that have remained utterly obscure. It's a miracle that only 34 died, but of course, more than 170 of your shipmates were injured. Ever since you and me and others have been trying to nail the lies that were put around by your government and by Israel. Speaking to survivors and studying what documents were available, including Jim Ennis's book and indeed the one written by Anthony Pearson a year or two earlier, I concluded swiftly that the attack was deliberate. The task for me was to find out why. I know many of you guys are still trying to get official recognition that the attack was intentional, but we have to move on and look behind that. During the course of the attack, within Israel, orders must have been transmitted from different control rooms in Tel Aviv and Haifa to 2 squadrons of Israeli planes, to 3 motor torpedo boats, a significant part of the Israeli Navy at the time, and to 2 helicopter gunships. This was not something that came together at the spur of the moment. As you well know, it is utterly implausible that Israel could maintain that it was a blunder, that they made a series of uncharacteristic mistakes. My first conclusion was not only that the attack was deliberate, but that the intention was to sink the ship and kill everyone aboard. When the attack was aborted, Israel had to start thinking about how to invent excuses. But it knew, and this is important, it knew that America was not going to be difficult, not going to dispute it. Why did it know that? Because it knew that it had as much to cover up as Israel had. As the afternoon wore on, of course, therefore, there was feverish activity in Israel trying to come up with seemingly plausible explanations for why they'd made so many mistakes. Of course, they never were able to make it plausible, but as you know, Washington accepted it. In fact, the American military proposed a counterstrike on Haifa, but that was blocked by the White House. They too began a massive cover-up, as you well know. How could Uncle Sam turn the other cheek? The answer lies in all the secrets that they had been keeping. It's absolutely tragic that you guys were bullied and cajoled into suppressing anything you might know about the attack, enabling, in fact, a completely false account of what happened to be published in the so-called inquiry that was conducted by the Navy. You must have wondered why you were in the middle of an Alice in Wonderland world, why you were being manipulated, why your country was so keen to keep everything under wraps. There are so many imponderables. For example, why had no help arrived from the Sixth Fleet, even though you received messages aboard USS Liberty that help was on its way? Prior to the attack, why was your ship placed in the middle of a war zone with no destroyer protection? Was there evidence, I think there was, that people aboard the ship knew attack might happen? Certainly, I think that Washington knew, and when signals were sent to move you out of the area, a very strange succession of events took place to make sure you never got the message. Of course, Liberty was in a war zone and listening into the war. And of course, you had been sent there very hurriedly from the coast of Africa. But you were not the only listening facility. In fact, there were many. There were other listening ships, aircraft, and ground-based stations, not just Americans, huge one being in Beirut. Another issue, of course, is why was the attack stopped just before the final coup de grace, when you would have been sunk and you would all be dead? There is, of course, a perfectly plausible explanation. The reason is that Israel tried to prevent Liberty sending out a signal of distress, but you did. You managed to get an SOS out. You did get a reply from the Sixth Fleet saying help was on its way. That meant planes were probably coming in your direction that would expose Israel as being the aggressor. At that point, clearly they had to abort. I heard another explanation from the head of the Israeli Navy, Shlomo Arel, who was a very decent man in my view and hugely regretted what happened. He said that he had actually put a stop to the attack. He was the one, of course, in charge of the motor torpedo boats. As you are well aware, and has been said before, this was a black op, and the plan was to blame the attack on Egypt. Why blame the attack on Egypt? Because they were looking for an excuse to punish Nasser regime in Cairo for a bogus event. How do we know that? So the planes that first attacked the Liberty were painted black with no visible markings. Those of you who were on the deck dodging bullets could therefore not identify your attacker and could not signal to the Sixth Fleet or anywhere else who was doing this dreadful thing. Now, unmarked planes cannot be produced quickly in an emergency. To me, this alone is evidence of premeditation, that this was a planned attack. In fact, it had probably been dreamed up long before. Once your ability to send out signals had been destroyed, the anonymity of the attack would not matter. But as I say, you did get out a signal, and that was crucial. You might say all the best laid plans of mice and men. Some of you have testified that the motor torpedo boats shot up your life rafts, meaning that you had no way of saving yourselves if the ship began to sink. This was, of course, a war crime, and it's further indication that the intention that nobody should be left alive to tell the tale. When the attack ceased and the ship managed to stay afloat, you have to conclude something had gone badly wrong with the Israeli operation. My first book on this terrible piece of skullduggery, which was published in 2003, focused on a secret plan called Operation Cyanide. That was the book's title. I've now done a follow-up book, it's nearly ready for publication, which goes much more deeply into all those facets of the Six-Day War. And I now have a much clearer picture of what was going on. Operation Cyanide has never been admitted by the American government. Aboard your ship, we know there were sealed orders about Operation Cyanide, but we don't know what they said. I have to conclude that your skipper probably read those orders and knew exactly what it was about. But of course, he never came forward, except towards the end of his life when he was very vague about criticizing the government. It is very sad that a man who was regarded as a hero, a victim of the affair himself because he was badly injured, could not come forward and talk properly and be candid about what he knew. I can tell you that Operation Cyanide was instituted at least a year before you were attacked. It was concocted by influential people in Israel and America working in the shadows. It had White House approval from a cutout mechanism called the 303 Committee. The fact that the 303 Committee had approved this operation means that Lyndon Johnson was well aware of it. Once agreed, it meant that those organizing the forthcoming war against Egypt had available all the military aid they needed from America, including the latest technology. And not just technology, there were people sent to Israel to help with the war too. I know the substance of all this from people who actually took part in Operation Cyanide. So I can tell you that from the late 1966 onwards, there were US military personnel, experts, stationed in Tel Aviv, helping with Operation Cyanide and planning for a forthcoming war against Egypt. In other words, it wasn't to defend Israel from an attack by Egypt. It was to promote an attack by Israel on Egypt. They had a lot of work to do. They had to plan the war, and they also had to come up with a convincing excuse for launching an attack, what is now called a casus belli. And I'll come on a little bit to what that meant. I have to admit that President Nasser, who led Egypt, was a great help to them. He was prone to make hot-headed pronouncements, attacking Israel, and threatening all sorts of dire consequences. Of course, he was trying to help the Palestinians, but he also wanted to bolster his own standing within the Middle East, where he was becoming a noted leader. Of course, it was said that he was seriously intending to attack Israel, and that Israel had to launch a war because it needed to preempt that. I don't believe it, because 70% of Nasser's forces were bogged down in a war in the Yemen. And he knew, and the Soviets had told him this, that he couldn't possibly win against Israel with just 30% of his normal fighting force. As part of Operation Cyanide, he was therefore characterized as a dangerous communist stooge, an unpredictable character, and of course, someone who was determined to destroy Israel. You've got to remember that this was the height of the Cold War. There was a great deal of scaremongering about Reds under the bed. A key group in Washington were the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who were almost rabidly anti-communist and determined to destroy the Soviet Union. And LBJ would have been in favor of a war in Egypt because he was bogged down in Vietnam, and a successful attack on Nasser would have bolstered his standing and helped him stand again for president in 1968. Israel was able to play along with American prejudices, but it wasn't a country that was fervently anti-communist, and it actually simply wanted America to keep the Soviet Union out of the way. For them, the war against Egypt was a means to an end. Yeah. Their objective was to launch an invasion of Jordan and grab territory in the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem, which was considered historical areas of the Jews. For Israel, having the US on side was important. They could block Soviet reactions, and they could quell world criticism. Having them actively assisting in the war was an even bigger benefit. And of course, America was in favor of attacking Egypt. Israel knew it had to tread carefully because the State Department would not approve of Israel attacking King Hussein, who was considered to be a close ally of the US. In fact, the CIA were paying him quite large sums of cash, partly for his own protection. Israel was therefore playing two sides against the middle, and it was a hell of a risky thing to do. We now come to the beginning of the Six-Day War on June the 5th. The cyanide plan was complete. The latest American high-tech equipment and trained operators from the US were in place. Vast amounts of arms in the previous months had been shipped to Israel, and it is said, and I think it's probably quite right, that quite a few pilots from America, probably Jewish ones, were also working inside the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. But Israel and US were uneasy partners. They had different motives, and they didn't really trust one another. Into this dangerous cocktail sailed your ship, the USS Liberty. By the time the Liberty reached its position close to the Egyptian coast, Israel had conquered the Sinai. Its troops were close to the Suez Canal. It had also started fighting in Jordan and had conquered large parts of the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem. It was at this point that things took a turn. America believed that Israeli forces would cross the Suez Canal and head for Cairo and get rid of Nasser. That had been the original plan. But they didn't realize that Moshe Dayan, the Israeli general who had become defense minister, had different ideas. When his troops arrived near the Suez Canal, he told them to go no further. At that point, America was in a complete dilemma. The war had been started to unseat Nasser, but Israel was refusing to go ahead with the idea. It left America having to deal with the problem itself. We'll come on in a minute to what actually happened as the Liberty attack unfolded. But we have to remember what was happening elsewhere in the area. Indeed, very close to the ship, because underneath Liberty, there was a Polaris submarine, the USS Andrew Jackson, which had followed your ship all the way from Spain. But remember, a submarine like that has only one purpose, and that is to strike against an enemy with nuclear weapons in the event of a nuclear war. So we have to consider that the American military had sent that submarine with you to the area with that eventuality in mind. Some of the things I'm going to say in a minute will amplify why that might have been the case. But the truth is that your military leaders knew something pretty catastrophic might happen when you got into the war zone. Further west from the Liberty, several hundred miles away near Crete, was the Sixth Fleet. Now, of course, one of the controversial issues is that the Sixth Fleet could have sent destroyers to accompany Liberty into the area, but that was refused. Another extraordinary thing is that signals were transmitted from Washington through many different channels to Liberty to get out of the area, but they never arrived. This was said to be just another series of blunders, but I don't believe in blunders in this context. It was a deliberate policy to keep you in place. You had to stay there. You had to be sitting ducks. But as the attack unfolded and the Sixth Fleet got a message from the Liberty that you were being attacked, instead of sending planes to your rescue, they started a counterattack on Cairo. And I need to go into this in a little bit of detail. I said in my first book that nuclear-armed planes were dispatched from the USS America, a huge aircraft carrier, to bomb Cairo. I know a great deal more now. How did I know that these planes were going to attack Cairo? Well, I've learned it from people on the USS America, including a catapult operator, the guy who put the planes in the air. And he said something quite chilling to me. The thing that has always struck me was how close we probably were to World War III. I can remember wondering if I was ever going to see my father or my sister again. It's a chilling remark. So, these planes, launched from the USS America, reached within 3 minutes of dropping these nuclear weapons on Cairo. We know that from several sources. They were well over Egyptian territory when an order came through for them to urgently return to base. A panic-stricken Robert McNamara and his president, Lyndon Johnson, came on the line and ordered the recall. Of course, we know that he also said in another call that he didn't want to embarrass an ally when it all came out that Israel was responsible for the attack. Altogether, 50 planes were dispatched towards Egypt. And after their recall, every one had to be counted in. It is reminiscent of Dr. Strangelove. Added to this, a powerful amphibious landing force was dispatched to land near El Alamein, and you could only assume that they were due to head for Cairo too. When it had to be recalled, it was clear the mission was a fiasco. But of course, it was also an outrage, because Egypt had not conducted the attack on the Liberty, it was the Israelis. It was impossible for America to escape censure if any of this came out. Its role is as reprehensible as that of Israel's, which is why my new book is called Goliath's Guilty Secret. Goliath is your country. You are the big boys helping Israel do all this. And there are more hair-raising stories to tell. And this also involves nuclear weapons. For years, it's quite well known now that Israel had been attempting to complete its first nuclear weapon at Dimona, their secret nuclear weapons plant in the Negev desert. By the summer of 1967, the CIA had intelligence that a bomb was near completion. As your ship neared its position, I now can say that this nuclear weapon was ready to be detonated. You were going to be in the fallout zone of where the bomb was going to go off. And it nearly did go off. There were teams in Israel ready to fly in helicopters with this device and detonate it in place. It was a suicide mission because they didn't have timing mechanisms for the bomb. They had to run a very long wire, nearly a mile, to a detonator and set it off themselves. And of course, being a mile from a bomb like that was likely to end in their deaths. Again, it's got shades of Dr. Strangelove. One of the brave volunteers who was due to go on the mission has spoken to me in detail. And he had something to say. This man understood that the bomb was going to be detonated on a mountain in the Sinai Desert. And he told me this. He said, I didn't know what it would mean for me to lay on a mountain 1.5 kilometers from a nuclear bomb. What happens? Am I going to burn immediately? Will I be thrown into the air? All sorts of things like that. There is another part to this story which is quite important, because there is another witness who worked for the Israeli military. He revealed that the Israeli government did not trust the military with the bomb. In the days running up to the war, a standoff occurred between the government and their own military about who should take charge of it. A special unit under the control of the government was put in charge of the core of the bomb. He was sent to guard the bomb in a fort south of Tel Aviv. As we got nearer to the war, a military unit turned up at this fort and demanded entry. They wanted to take control of the core of the bomb. He was under orders not to hand it over. And over the next few days, there was a big struggle over who should take control. In the end, it was decided they should both control the core of the bomb. What it shows is that the government didn't trust the military, and the military didn't trust their own government, and nor did the military think they had to take orders from the government by this stage. From participants in this extraordinary sequence of events, we know a great deal more about what was going on. The operation to place a bomb in Egypt was called Operation Samson, which indicates it was a sort of suicide mission, a last-ditch measure. And some of these people have indicated that the Americans knew about it, that they knew what Israel was up to. We must consider whether this was another reason why USS Liberty was sent close to the proposed blast area. Or is it just a bizarre coincidence? I doubt it. Putting all these pieces of the puzzle together, it is no exaggeration to say that we were close to World War III. How close is revealed in my final story. And it's equally spine-tingling. America's Strategic Air Command was controlled from a huge underground nerve center in Arizona. Its role was to launch a nuclear blitzkrieg on Russia and China. Its primary means of doing that were B-52 nuclear-armed bombers. I now know that before the Liberty attack, these bombers were put on high alert. I interviewed a pilot of a B-52 who was on high alert in California, and he was placed in that position and put on high readiness before the Liberty attack. We also know that in Arizona, at SAC headquarters, similar measures were in place. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the involvement of the SAC suggests that other countries should well have known what was going on, because launching a nuclear war involved NATO. And the involvement of SAC suggests America and Israel were not the only countries that might have been involved in events of that period. SAC was, of course, hooked into NATO, which was based in Europe. NATO was led by an American General Lemnitzer, who was also had a second job, which was being in charge of US forces in Europe, including the Mediterranean. These countries, members of NATO, probably knew something about this emergency and are also holding secrets about the Six-Day War. Britain was in a perfect position to keep an eye on what was going on. It had amazing electronic listening facilities in Cyprus. One crucial piece of evidence came to me recently, and that is that a squadron of Lightning aircraft, which were trained and designed to counter a Soviet nuclear attack, were on high alert in Cyprus for the whole duration of the Six-Day War. So what did Britain know about the Six-Day War that they've never told us about? Further supporting evidence is that British intelligence agents were working alongside American personnel in Israel as part of Operation Sinai in 1966, planning the war against Egypt. How do I know this? I have interviewed people who were there who confirm it. Britain has never admitted having any involvement in the Six-Day War. In fact, it went to great lengths after the war to try and maintain that any suggestion of that was a big lie. That was the name they gave it. A huge public relations assault on the media was instituted to try and prevent Arab countries from stopping oil reaching Britain. It was unsuccessful. This is such a complex story. It is understandable we are still searching for answers. But even after more than 50 years, it is vitally important that we keep searching, not just from a historical perspective, but because it still has a bearing on modern world problems, not least the Palestinian problem. I want to end with another story. In the early 60s, long before the Six-Day War, a plan called Operation Northwoods was drawn up by the Pentagon. The idea was to blacken the character of Fidel Castro, label the country Cuba as an aggressor, and create a casus belli, a justification for America launching an attack on the country. When Operation Northwoods was brought to Kennedy in the Oval Office, he was horrified. It had numerous black ops that he strongly disapproved of. The man who brought that plan to him was General Lyman Lemnitzer, the guy who was in charge of US forces in Europe during the Six-Day War. Kennedy was so furious that within months he had Lemnitzer dispatched to Europe. He considered him to be a highly dangerous man. He was a hawk, virulently anti-communist, and prepared to do almost anything to get rid of the Soviet Union, including launch a nuclear war. The Northwoods Plan proposed many provocations, but one in particular is relevant. It recommended that an American ship should be sailed into Havana harbor where it would blow up. This would then be blamed on Cuba, giving an excuse to America to invade. The idea, as far as the Joint Chiefs of Staff were concerned, and Lemnitzer in particular, the use of nukes were not off the agenda in that eventuality. We therefore must ask whether the attack on the Liberty was modelled on these sort of dirty tricks tactics, because they are so similar in terms of the detail. My new book goes into all these facets and obviously in much more detail. It also looks at what was going on in the White House and in Israel at the time. As I mentioned earlier, Israel was in a fractious state. There was a rift between the military and the government. In fact, in Israel now, they consider that there was tantamount to a coup by the military over the government in this period. In Washington, we have to look at what was going on within the White House. There were very strong Jewish-Israeli connections between Johnson and some of his close allies. All that needs picking apart before we fully understand what was going on. But my main conclusion is it is impossible that McNamara and Johnson did not know of the events in the Mediterranean. They may not have known how far it might go, they may not have known the detail, but they certainly approved the basics. You guys have lived with this story for so long. It's probable you haven't got any further evidence to provide, but I urge you to think whether anything you know or anything your colleagues know might add to this story, because if you want to help a bit further, please email me. My email address is peterhounam, my name, at mac.com, mac.com. Because although the book is coming to an end, the website that will go with it will continue to add further evidence as we build it up. Because I haven't given up hope, and I hope you haven't, that one day the American government will do a proper inquiry. This story is a live one. You only have to see what has been happening in Gaza in the last month to see that what happened in the Six-Day War has had ramifications all through the decades. The plight of the Palestinians is still the same. Israel has tried through the years to create a Jewish state, but it hasn't been able to live in peace with its neighbors. The story has not yet ended. That's all I have to say for now. Thanks for listening.